Heard daily on Bible School Radio 91.3, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas-Fort Worth, and on 91.3 KYJC, Commerce.
Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, the latest on the banking situation, today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know, I do appreciate it. I do have a line open if you'd like to call the program with a comment and or a question. The number to call is 1-877-913-5357. 1-877-913-5357. You can also go to the website at prudentmoney.com. Send a question in, and I will get you taken care of. That's all at the website, www.prudentmoney.com. 1-877-913-5357. Well, I got to tell you that today's environment reminds me so much of when I was doing radio in 2008 during the financial crisis. What was similar were bailouts, takeovers, company failures. And what's interesting, I was just thinking about this, is that back in 2008, of course, the failures were huge companies, much bigger than we're seeing right now. Not to downplay what's, that these banks have failed, but to maybe inject into the story some of the size of these companies that went under in 2008. I mean, you had to look at a lot of the mortgage companies that went down, but the big ones were, Lehman Brothers went completely belly up. The government didn't try to bail them out, which almost caused a complete collapse of the financial system. And then you had Bear Stearns that collapsed, and of course they finally had a buyer buy what was left of Bear Stearns. And I think what's interesting about this environment is that you have on a much smaller scale the same things going on, but you have something that you didn't have in 2008. You had prior history. The government taking over things, bailouts, all those types of situations. You just kind of look at it and go, yeah, so, we're used to that. We've been there, done that. Back in 2008, it was really shocking when it happened. And there was a whole lot of sensationalism that went along with it. There's sensationalism that's going on around with what's happening today. And the thing is, the toughest things about this environment, number one, I don't believe, and I don't mean this as an insult by any stretch, because it is tough to truly get a grasp on and explain in layman's terms what's happening. And I don't think that a lot of the media completely understands and can put it into layman terms. I know I can't put it all into layman terms. I can read it, I can understand and know what's happening, but to communicate that to a widespread audience that's at different levels of understanding of how these financial issues work, make it to where everybody understands. I mean, it's almost impossible. So what ends up happening is that as a bank, as someone who's a consumer, as someone who banks, you have people waking up and getting sound bites of Credit Suisse, 167-year-old bank, collapsing, getting bought, pretty much a takeover, bailout. And you hear about these other banks that have collapsed, that have gone down, bank failures. And the first thing you say, and the first thing that you don't know anything else really about it, you just continue to hear a little bit about it. I always like to talk to my wife, to kind of to let me know what she's heard about things, because I know that she's not staying glued to the social media, the news media, and all that kind of thing. So I always find it interesting as to what her takeaways from things are. And so you get a little bit of this here, get a little bit of this there, and you start to have questions about what you're doing. That's why I like to continue to bring up the new things that happen, remind you of what's taking place, so that you stay informed and make good decisions, and so that you're not surprised at what may happen. Okay, so to get us caught up, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank of New York, starting Friday a week ago, Silicon Valley Bank went under. Regulators took it over. Then Signature Bank of New York, regulators took over. And then we had First Republic Bank that is surfaced as a problem bank. Basically, they've had a run on the bank, and they've lost, last number that I heard, $70 billion in deposits. That's literally half the deposits that they had. And they're looking for a buyer, and they're looking for somebody to take them over, and they haven't had anybody that wants to step up. And you can't blame any bank for not wanting to step up, because number one, they're looking for a fire sale. A buyer would be. They want to get those assets for next to nothing. And First Republic Bank had a $30 billion cash infusion into the bank, and as far as deposits go. And as far as deposits go, and really, sorry about that. I had to. It's always interesting. We have to multitask on the radio show, with the live radio show, and getting a text to my phone that I had to answer because Chris was telling me something. Okay. Excuse me. So, excuse me. So it's Monday, right? So, where was I? Oh, yeah. Okay, so they had a cash infusion of $30 billion from some of the big banks. And really, that was, they call it as a vote of confidence. Well, really, that was put into play to offset some of these deposits that they've lost. Then you had the big ratings companies come in, downgrading the bank even further. Today, just today, the stock was down another almost 50% today. Get this, January the 4th, 2022, which was the height of the entire market, First Republic Bank was at $202 a share, down to $12.31 a share today, last time I looked. $202 a share, down to $12.31. 2 weeks ago, it was $120 a share, down to $12.31. So, it's one of these things where I would be surprised. The government doesn't want the word bailout associated with them, even though I think that they are arranging some of these marriages, if you will, between these companies. So they are looking for takeovers, buying a bank, something that this sounds, maybe not the word takeover, but another bank buying a bank. It feels a lot better than takeover, bank failures, whatnot. You call it what you want to call it. I think they're bank failures. Credit Suisse. Okay, so First Republic Bank, I don't know why I keep saying Republican. Republic Bank was our first problem child bank. Our second problem child bank is Credit Suisse, 167-year-old bank. This weekend bought by UBS, as can't call it anything else besides a bailout. Now, this reminds me a whole lot and this is pure speculation, but you have to admit this is speculation that wouldn't shock anybody if it were true. Is it a far-fetched belief that the European government, did not arrange for UBS to buy out Credit Suisse and gave UBS a little bit of a bonus for doing so? I think the same thing happened with Bank of America back in 2008 when they reluctantly, kind of with holding their nose, they took over Merrill Lynch and was a very problematic investment company at the time. And Bank of America brought them in. Of course, that's worked out, I guess. But I've always felt like and heard backup rumors that was arranged by the government. You take care of this situation for us, we'll take care of that situation for you. And of course, Bank of America has been in their share of problem situations, so having the government on your side probably isn't a bad thing. But this Credit Suisse takeover, collapse, bailout, whatever you want to call it, bank failure, wiped out $17 billion for bondholders. Investors who held Credit Suisse bonds. Now listen to this. Think about this for a second. On one hand, you had a 167-year-old bank that has withstood the test of time and has people buying bonds. I would assume they were highly rated bonds, and they get wiped out. And of course, the lawsuits, I think, have begun today about that situation. Then you have Credit Suisse. I was just looking at a very brief history, and this was a bank full of controversy. We'll get back to that in a second. 1-877-913-5357. This is Bob Brooks. Stick around. I'll be right back.
The Word for Today is excited to announce the new official online home for the ministry of Pastor Chuck Smith and Kay Smith, PastorChuck.org. At PastorChuck.org, you'll have instant access to thousands of hours of verse-by-verse teaching by Pastor Chuck Smith from Genesis through Revelation, and full access to special messages on subjects such as prophecy and much, much more. Also at PastorChuck.org, a full library of great teachings by Kay Smith, and a section where you can read some of Pastor Chuck's books online, all free of charge. So visit the new official online home of the Word for Today and the ministry of Pastor Chuck and Kay Smith, PastorChuck.org.
Hi, my name is Bob Brooks, host of the Prudent Money Radio Show. So let me ask you a question. Do you know your numbers? Now, which numbers are those? They are your retirement numbers. That set of numbers is the single most important planning numbers you can know. Yet the majority of Americans don't even know them. Prudent Money Financial Services, sponsor of the Prudent Money Radio Show, specializes in figuring out those numbers and creating a game plan to make sure you're on the right track. Listen to the Prudent Money Radio Show weekdays at 3 p.m. on Bible School Radio 91.3.
Dynamic, practical, life-changing.
There's no point in going to church and not letting the Christ who gave birth to the church on the day of Pentecost change your life.
Join us each day as Pastor Paul Shepherd applies the timeless truth of Scripture to everyday life. It's Destined for Victory on this great station.
Weekday afternoons at 3:30 here on Bible School Radio, KDKR.
Welcome back. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. 1-877-913-5357. That is the number to call, and I do have a line open. So I was looking back in the history of Credit Suisse, not a real good timeline of events. I think if you read that, you'd go, maybe I don't want to buy bonds in this country. Let me just mention Wells Fargo to you and their sterling reputation and record going back 2 or 3 years. That's probably the same thing that you're going to see with Credit Suisse. So are we looking for a banking crisis? So I want to go back to this question and revisit it again because it's a question that I get daily. And should you move your money? Well, I think that it's important to know that the optics in our environment can get out of control. They can go viral. They can be centered around a theme that this is happening, and I think it would be easy to kick up a optic of a banking crisis and of a run on the banks. So having said that, I believe that you don't want to have more than the $250,000 limit per depositor in any bank, because that's what the FDIC insurance covers, is just that $250,000 per depositor. To give you an example of that, let's say at one bank you have a $500,000 in a joint account. You and your spouse are on that account. Well, both you and your spouse are two depositors. 2 times $250,000 is $500,000, so you're both covered. But if you had another $250,000 in one other account, that would not be covered. Only the $250,000 per depositor. So I think that is, until that changes, and keep in mind that if we had a serious banking crisis, the Federal Reserve Board could step in. I don't know if this is a great idea. It's got a lot of downsides to it. But could step in and cover 100% of the assets. I've had the reaction to saying that. I've had people laugh, and although I do think that is a funny idea as well, it's not something that's. I mean, it's being debated around in the circles of Wall Street and the government. What would that look like? And they're having serious conversations about it. So anyway, so if you're with we'll just pick on Wells Fargo. You're with the Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo gets into trouble, and they were to head towards a bank failure. I just don't believe in a minute that the government's going to let that bank go. I think that you'll get a nationalized banking system if it got bad enough. When really, I think we've got a undercover nationalized situation going on. I think that the government's got pretty much control where they need it, but this would be over the top control. So I came across this article today, which I thought was disturbing. Not that you wouldn't think it would be true. It's actually in the Washington Post. And it says at least 200 banks are in the same shape as Silicon Valley Bank. Okay, that was the first bank, if you don't count Silvergate. But Silvergate was a bank that was a crypto casualty, which I don't know that I'd count that as a bank failure. 200 banks in the same shape as Silicon Valley Bank, and Silicon Valley Bank was in bad shape, obviously. It says the fears that another interest rate will hasten more bank failure will loom over the Federal Reserve's meeting this week after a study found that nearly 200 banks are at risk of the same sort of collapse as the one at Silicon Valley Bank. Now, what's interesting about that is that there's a study that found and put together information on nearly 200 banks. I think it was 186 banks that are at risk of the same sort of collapse as the one at Silicon Valley Bank. I don't think that if the Federal Reserve Board goes and raises interest rates 0.25% this week, that's going to cause and ignite a problem for banks. If they were to come in and say, okay, we're going to raise it 0.75%, yes, maybe, but not 0.25%. And that's what they're kind of rumored to be looking at. It says a fear that another rate hike from the Federal Reserve to tamp, must be a misspelled word, down inflation will sap. I didn't read this ahead of time. This was copy and paste from the New York Post. From the Washington Post. Will sap the value of banks' assets such as government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Excuse me. That would make them vulnerable to a run by depositors the same way Silicon Valley Bank became insolvent. You see, what they're looking at, and this is one other thing that you got to keep in mind, not trying to downplay the potential of a crisis or anything that's gone on, but I do want to point out Silicon Valley, the problem with that bank is that they had, and I don't know what percentage of deposits, but a large percentage of deposits were exceeded per depositor the $250,000 mark. So, if I'm sitting here with $1 million sitting in Silicon Valley Bank, I'm probably going to move my $1 million out of there, or at least $750,000. But I think if I'm motivated to move money from a bank that I've had confidence in, I have no confidence in, I'm probably not just moving $750,000. I'm probably moving $1 million. It says the recent declines in bank asset values very significantly increased the fragility of the U.S. banking system to uninsured depositor runs. Our calculations, there we go, thank you, suggest these banks are certainly at a potential risk of a run absent other government intervention or recapitalization. Ugh. The network study estimated that 186 banks in the U.S. are vulnerable if just half of their depositors withdrew their funds. Now that is disturbing on quite a few levels. But do you move your money? I don't think that you move it out of fear. I don't think that you move it out of anything except for from a stewardship standpoint. You look at it and go, okay, I've accumulated $400,000. I have one account, one depositor, which is me, in a bank that's only $250,000 covered. I should move that money and stay under the $250,000 FDIC limit. I just think it's good stewardship. I'm not moving because I'm afraid of a bank crisis or a bank meltdown. Here's one of the reasons why I think people won't do it, like I said, I've had this conversation a lot just today, is that it's a major inconvenience to go to the bank, get your check, go to another bank, set up an account, deposit it. Just something else, when you can rationalize, well, things aren't just exactly falling apart yet or anything like that. So, but that's pretty much the answer. I think that if we had a major bank meltdown, you'd see the government stop in and backstop. This is the new word, not bail out, but backstop every deposit. I know, sounds crazy, but it's been batted around Washington and in the news circles. Okay, question: why wouldn't you put your money in cash, money market, if the money market is earning 4% plus? I think that one of the things we've seen with money markets is, we've had to, for the longest of time, deal with money markets paying nothing to us, or 0.25%. Well, those same, and I'll just pick on Fidelity because that's the ones I know. Fidelity is sitting at 4.25%. Absolutely, if you're wanting a more conservative, I'm not going to say safe because anything can happen. It would, if let me say this: if those money markets were failing at a Fidelity, we'd have bigger problems on our hands. It's because they're not insured, by the way. You want to make sure you know that. But from the standpoint of a alternative to bonds, I like money markets. People don't look at money markets as an alternative to anything investment-wise, but if you've got a conservative as conservative can get money market account that is paying over 4.25%, that's a decent place to be in times like this. And it's funny because I think people are just now waking up. I read the statistic last week. There's about $17 trillion sitting in savings and checking accounts at the big banks, that Americans lost out on $603 billion worth of yield in the past 8 years, because banks, the big banks especially, are not paying 4.25%. They're paying way under that. You have to go to a Fidelity or a Vanguard or something like that to get those types of rates. So, hope that clears some things up for you. If you've got any questions, you know where to go. This is Bob Brooks. If you have a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time. Keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.